Hello. So in this series of videos, I'm going to be doing very brief overviews of different historical modes of reading or schools of literary and cultural theory. I'm going to try and cover a lot of them. Most of them will be 20th and 21st century because this is when we really had a proliferation of schools of critical thought. But in these very brief summaries, I'm going to try and give you a sense of the key ideas, key concerns, key innovations, and maybe some major drawbacks of these different schools. You'll also see that some of these schools have similar sets of concerns, and there's a lot of overlap between different approaches to literary and cultural theory, different approaches to how we read. In this video, we're going to talk about Marxist literary criticism. Now, most people, when they think of Marxism, think of either political economics or political philosophy. We think of the Soviet Union, we think of communist China, we think of Cuba, etc., etc. And that's not inherently wrong, but when we think about Marxism from the perspective of literary and cultural theory, we're not always necessarily thinking political economics or politics directly. So basically the idea of Marxism as a political, economic, and political system is that over time, societies develop. There is a progression through different stages in which the means of production shifts. Means of production basically means the dominant way in which goods and services are produced and distributed within a society. So you had what Marx would call slave economies of the ancient world, then you had feudalism, then you had capitalism, then Marx envisioned socialism and communism following from there. So that's one of the central ideas. The reason that these social shifts happen, the reason that we move through these historical periods in traditional Marxist theory, is because each social system carries within it contradictions. The idea is that communism will not have those contradictions. It is the ultimate resolution of those contradictions. The Soviet Union, China, Cuba, North Korea, these are not really communist systems in the sense that Marx was talking about. They did not resolve the fundamental conflicts of capitalism. So that's worth just saying right there. And that's not to try and drop into a no true Scotsman fallacy of like, they aren't really communist. The reality is they just aren't. In Marxist theory, in terms of what's called dialectical materialism, which is the historical progression through different modes of production, these societies simply are not. They are not the failure of the contradictions within capitalism leading naturally and inevitably to the next social phase. That's simply not what they are. So the reason that the reason that we move through these different historical stages, each society bears within it certain contradictions, and when the weight of those contradictions becomes overwhelming, that social system collapses and is replaced with a new one that's intended to resolve those contradictions. The main source of contradictions within any given society is class conflict for the traditional Marxist. There are those who own the means of production, whether that's slave owners, emperors, whatever it is in the ancient world, kings, aristocracy, the church in feudalism, capitalists, bourgeoisie, owners of businesses, etc., in capitalism, etc., etc. And then there are those who don't own the means of production. Slaves, peasants, workers, largely, in those three historical periods. This is one of the big elements that Marxism contributes to a wide variety of disciplines: sociology, political theory, literature, literary studies, etc., etc., is the idea of social conflict theory. So basically, the idea of social conflict theory is that society is not made up of one unified whole, the way that somebody like Jean-Jacques Rousseau or John Locke envisioned it as being. There is no general will in Rousseau's terms. Instead, society is made up of competing interests. And they struggle for power, they struggle for resources, they struggle for control of the society. And what happens is society is shaped based on that struggle. Society is the conglomerate of these different struggling factions, the biggest two being those who own the means of production and those who don't, those who exploit labor and those whose labor is exploited. But society is glued together by that conflict rather than by a fundamental unity. The conflict is not, as, again, somebody like Rousseau and Locke thought, the conflict is not a deviation from the basic norm of society. The conflict is fundamental to the society. It is constitutive of the society. One of the big things that Marxist critics read for is social conflict. How is conflict being played out within this text, and how does that reflect on the society that has produced this text? So sometimes this is very directly like we're going to read Jane Austen and we'll think about the absence of servants' voices or something like this. But often this is more subtle. This is reading for conflict to understand how competing interests are situated within this society and what that tells us about the society at large. The other big thing, or one of the other big things that Marxist critics introduced, is the idea of false consciousness. Now, this is something actually that W.E.B. Du Bois gives us a really interesting variation on for African Americans. It's double consciousness. But in Marxist theory, basically the idea of false consciousness is when someone has been convinced to endorse a social system or participate in a social system that is contrary to their class interests. So when workers, for instance, vote for capitalists who say, I want to deregulate business, I want to weaken employee protections, I want to stop labor unions, etc., etc., all of those policies are terrible for workers, but because workers have been conditioned to identify with the capitalist system as though the capitalist system benefits them rather than exploits them, workers will support that candidate. So this is the idea of false consciousness. You are voting against your own interests, you are participating in a social system and actively supporting a social system that is contrary to your interests because you have misidentified your interests as aligning with the interests of that system. That becomes a big thing in literary criticism because it lays the foundation for a lot of internal conflicts for characters, not just workers, but in, for instance, post-colonial literature, you very often have characters who are natives who participate in, say, colonial police or the colonial military and oppress their own people in the interests of the colonizers. So you get these kinds of things. And the idea of false consciousness or even double consciousness, and Du Bois's variation, double consciousness, is basically the idea that you are aware of yourself as having two different identities, that you're an American and you're an African, and that those two identities are in some way irreconcilable. So this is again an outgrowth of false consciousness, of where you identify with and even endorse or support a system that oppresses and exploits you. We read for these things in, again, this search for how conflict within a society is represented, but also how conflict within the individual psyche is reflected. And there's a decent number of contemporary Marxist thinkers who actually do also use the tools of psychoanalysis to try and understand this in a more complex way. So it's not just a sociological and political economic situation, but it's also a psychological situation. I fall into that camp, typically. I do Marxist literary criticism and psychoanalytic literary criticism. For me, the two things are not necessarily divisible. Now, one of the big strengths of Marxist literary criticism is because these ideas of social conflict theory, false consciousness, and dialectical materialism can be read across different contexts. The tools of Marxist literary criticism actually lend themselves to a number of other philosophies. So social conflict theory especially is fundamental to feminism. It's fundamental to post-colonialism, to critical race studies, etc., etc. The idea of false consciousness is central to these things as well. And so while there is just straight Marxist critique that looks at the conflict within societies, particularly conflict over control of the means of production and socio-economic or political economic control, there's also a set of tools that Marxist literary criticism gives us that can be used in a number of other contexts.